But I think one of the things to think about is, you know, Vivian May talks about not having the either or, but the and both. You know, so I think when doing intersectionality work, you have to consider all the different areas of, you know, the different social markers. You might can think about them separately to try to understand, okay, then what does the gender lens give to me? What does the racial lens give to me? You know, what does the you know, what does a social economic status lens give to me? And then see them, kind of understand them in their own, and then see where they overlap. I mean, that's really the beauty of the intersectionality, that is really hard to separate them. But I think as a researcher, you want to think about them individually and then put the layers on top of it, which gives you so much more depth and complexity. But it also gives you a challenge to be able to write about it, because at one point, where do you know it's a gender and racial lens? At what point do you know it's a gender and SCS lens? And so, but I think that's the part you want to be able to think about. How do you play around with all these different ideas in your head at the same time, and but still trying to understand who that participant is? And I think that's why, you know, at the end, I'm glad I'm answering first. Maybe I'm taking up too much time, but now I think that's why I'm finding that Jam board is going to be very useful for me. I've used it in the past with them using the social markers, identities, but then also I think somebody mentioned also in the question about, you know, it doesn't always stay the same. So then how do you overlay even this idea of understanding privilege across it all? Because there are certain spaces I go in as an African-American woman, I have a very privileged status. Other places I'm not. And so I'm trying to get students and my teachers to understand, like, even though, you know, you see your particular identities in a particular way, but what happens when your context changes? What happens when you're in contexts with other people and their identities are also at play? You know, this is really great work that Heidi does, you know, this idea around, you know, how people see you and how others see you and how that plays its role. But again, as a researcher, just try to think about it. How do they individually play a role, but then how do they collectively come back together to give you some depth of understanding, but then additional questions that you may want to go back and ask.
Thank you, Felicius. Some of the other three of you want to build on that, comment on that?
Sure, I think she said a lot that kind of mirrors some of the process that I personally had to go through. I think the biggest thing is to read. Because what tends to happen is we begin to misappropriate the term because we don't have an in-depth knowledge of it. We'll read how people cite it or the parts that they put in the article, but we actually don't go back to the primary sources. And so I would just start off by saying to read. And then the second step I would say is to do more introspective work. So once you can't understand someone's intersectionality or try to define someone else's identity if you haven't done the work for yourself. And so going back and figuring out which aspects of your identity, on Lucy's, she showed one of those figures, and that's a figure that I've used in one of my doctoral seminars, because you have, and it kind of aligns with what Felicia was saying, you have in some spaces where your identities are going to give you privilege, and then in some spaces where it'll be more marginalized. And so how do you negotiate that and the role of your identities in these different spaces? And then I would also say that you have to begin to name them, because to me, I just had to get comfortable saying I'm doing work with Black girls. I'm a Black woman science educator, and I am doing work with Black girls. And, you know, I've kind of gotten challenged on that in multiple lenses. Well, why don't you just do girls of color? And I'm like, because I don't know, you know, that's not what I do. You know, we can't continue to essentialize that all girls of color have the same experience. I know what tends to happen in maybe low-income communities, particularly with that serve Black and brown children, but my work has really centered on the specialized experience of girls, and then Black girls at that. And then if we can begin to not try to spend so much time, you know, wanting to include so many people and include so many populations, but we can actually begin to disaggregate it a little bit more, to delve a little deeper into what we're seeing, not just where things are going wrong, because I think Science Ed has done a good job of giving us statistics in terms of which people are represented and who aren't, but what can we do differently? And can we get that information from the population who we're saying that we're serving? And so I think my last point would be to begin to really position ourselves as learners in this space, and not to take our own positionalities. We can't take it for granted. And so just because I am a Black woman doesn't mean that I know I need to speak on behalf of all Black women or on behalf of all Black girls. And so even I make sure to still just use my platform in this space to give their, to elevate their own voices, where it's not, me speaking on behalf of, but me using a platform to elevate voice. And so I think if we begin to think about our roles differently, that would also help us to engage in this work a little bit more authentically.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think it touches upon some of the other themes actually in the Padlet about your own research position and positionality, as you just said. So what do you do if you are a white male from a privileged social background and you want to engage and you want to do research on intersectionality and you want to move into marginalized groups in science education? Any advices or considerations to colleagues that move into fields where they are not familiar, as you also said, Katie, that you do not share the experiences by default with the field that you're entering? Any advices here? What should you, as a newcomer or a researcher with like a different positionality, what should you consider?
I could share a bit about this based on my experiences, and I'm following on what Natalie and Felicia said earlier. So for me, the first advice will be read a lot and spend a lot of years reading. So for myself, I've been reading about Black feminism, intersectionality for more than 15 years. And I was introduced to intersectionality, Black feminism in early 2000 when I was in the US. And I never used it in my work until very recently, actually, until the last 4 years. So that's a long time. Maybe I'm a bit slow, but I actually never felt comfortable of using it. But what happened in the past 4 years is that I moved to a new context. I saw a question here about women in the dominant culture. So for the first time, after a long time, I realized that a lot of identities or intersection of identities that I had when I was living in Cyprus that serve as privilege in this context, in this place, were not served as privilege, and they placed me in a disadvantage group. So that's one take-home message, that the fluidity of identity and how the places that we move might position us as insiders or outsiders in specific contexts. And I can talk about one study that I did. So what I shared today is a study with 3 participants, 3 women. But the past 4 years, I engaged in research with one of those participants, who is a Turkish woman, Muslim, physicist, also a migrant in the Netherlands. So we share some identities, but we certainly don't share a religion identity. I'm an atheist and she's Muslim. So I had to work a lot. I'm a complete outsider in terms of that religious identity for her. So how did we work that out? First, I did have some experiences based on the fact that I grew up in Cyprus. So I had personal experiences at least of, and I had some understanding of Islam or Islamic religious identity. So that's one. I spent 3 years getting closer to her, and I didn't start collect data until after 3 years. And in those 3 years, I got to know her really, really well. We formed a very close friendship where I felt and she felt comfortable of sharing essentially her life with me. So it took me 3 years to kind of get of minimizing my outsider status. So that's as an example. Will I ever do work with Black women? No, absolutely not. I don't have the experiences, and I'm a complete outsider in that context. But also, I would never be able to understand their experiences, because in the context where I am right now, I'm very distant from understanding their lived experiences. Even if I did a lot of work on myself in terms of my positionality, reflexivity, and so on, I would never be able to cross that bridge or minimize that space between us, like Katie did.
I think, and perhaps Katie, we could hear your experiences, because I think also what you said, Lucy, about reading, that some of our participants today are doing a PhD. They might have like 3 years and not 15 years of reading. So does that mean that they should like stay out of intersectionality, or do we have any good advices of how to begin taking like small steps? And I think, Katie, you are a good example of one who actually worked with intersectionality as a lens in your PhD period. So perhaps you can share some experiences of that journey.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and I would just agree with what Lucy said and what Dr. King said, that reading and then reflecting on your own identity is kind of the foundation there, right? So reading as much as you can, reflecting on your own identity. But then also for me, it was a piece of reflecting on my motivation. And I saw several comments about, or a comment about maybe white saviorism and this idea of, you know, what is the role of a white researcher in this space? And that was something that I struggled with a lot when I started doing research. And I think that intersects with your identities, or how you see yourself as a researcher is going to influence how you're viewing your participants, right? So I did not spend 15 years reading and preparing, but I did spend, you know, a solid year working with the girls in the program and just getting to know them and really kind of building that relationship, building that trust. And I read a book, Django Paris, Humanizing Research, which kind of deconstructed this idea that we have to be objective researchers and we have to go in and have our interview scripts and everything. And it made it okay to do that, right? And I think that's so important in identity work, to just sit with the girls, eat pizza, ask them about their lives. And it took a while to build up to where we could discuss things like race and science and gender and race and things like that. It didn't happen right away, and I didn't push it on them. I waited until they were comfortable and they were excited to share their experiences with me. So I think that was an important piece to me. And I think as researchers in identity, when we think about coming in as a white woman or white male, really thinking first, okay, why am I working with this population? Why did I decide to? Is it because it was convenient? This is where I could get consent forms? Is it because I know that people like to publish when you're talking about underrepresented minorities? Or, you know, really checking yourself as to, or do I really want to understand these experiences? Do I really think that this is a valuable contribution and that I have something that I can share and do here? Now, I didn't necessarily do that reflection before I began the research in my dissertation because I wasn't there yet. I wasn't at that point yet, but that would be my advice to people going forward. And embrace the fact that it's going to take a while and it's going to be really messy and it's going to involve a lot of going back and forth. So I did a lot of, you know, okay, this just happened. I don't know what it means. Let me do a little more reading. Oh, this person said this thing, maybe that, you know, and back and forth between the literature, the experiences, and chatting with the girls. And I will say that member checking and getting comfortable with that was really valuable for my piece, for me to say, okay, this is what I saw and this is how I interpreted it as a white woman researcher, but how did this 6th grade Black girl interpret that experience? And a lot of times it was completely differently, surprise. So being open to that and being open to saying that I interpreted it that way, not necessarily that it's wrong, but that's my perspective and my lens that I saw it. It's not the only lens and it's not the most valuable lens in this situation.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Katie. And I can see Felicia also have a good advice in the chat for how to begin working with intersectionality. Time is flying. I have one tiny question that I would like each of you to comment on here in the end. And that is, if you should give your your past self a good advice, on working with intersectionality. So turning back time, and you could like sit in front of your past self and get some advices with your like current experience, what would that advice be? And Felicia, I know it's a hard question, but would you begin with sharing your advice to your past self?
Yeah, so what would I tell my younger self about doing this kind of work?
Yes. Like, don't do it, or do it in this way, or
yeah, that is a hard question. I think my younger self had intuitively known some things, but didn't have the language for it. So I wish I had read sooner. I mean, getting back to this idea around reading. And so when I started going, and that's why I put it in notes, like researchers take on ideas and they go through time sometimes to the point where it gets a little bit watered down, and then you kind of like lose the intent and meaning of it. So to me, that was why I like the historical part of going backward and reading and getting kind of like getting the foundational roots of it. And so I wish I had done that much sooner, because I think it would have saved me language. It would have saved me my own experiences, and give me a chance to kind of understand me, and even the participants that I was working with, had I had that original language earlier on. And that and just even the conceptualization of what intersectionality is. And I think this is, again, the reason why Hancock work is really compelling to me at this particular point. That, you know, do we think about intersectionality as intellectual property of Black women and the scholarship around it, or do we think about it in a much broader context? And so I'm still going back and trying to find, you know, where, you know, I don't even have the words for it, but it's like just still trying to go back and try to just think about the experiences, you know, going back from even before Kimberly Crenshaw, you know, coined the phrase. It was even before her, you know, going back to the historical time of Sojourner Truth, you know, even back to that particular point, understanding the context of where it was, what was happening. And then, but me as a researcher to say, yeah, that was actually my legacy that was back there that I don't even know about. And so those are the kinds of things I would tell myself now, like 20 years ago, you know, going back and reading that, so that it becomes a little bit more powerful to me as an individual, as a Black woman, but then trying to understand the larger diaspora that also talks about intersectionality. So that's what I would tell my younger self, like, go back and read.
Yeah.
All of you.
A lot
so
of
now
reading.
I'm telling you all here in this space, like, read now.
Yeah.
Go ahead and get that. But the language was very, I mean, it was just like eye-opening when you come to, I mean, Bell Hooks talks about it as well, is that when she started talking and reading work by Paulo Freire, is like, he gave her the language. And I feel like when I go back and I read, it's like they have the language that's there for me to understand what's going on now.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Felicia. Lucy, what would you tell your past self?
Yeah, I don't know, Henriette. More reading. I think one thing that I would have liked to know years ago is that it's a very growing experience to engage with intersectionality, not only from a research perspective, but because it challenges a lot of your ideas about how the world works and what your role in the work is, in this world is. So for me, it helped me also a lot beyond the research. It helped me a lot, and it made me grow as a supervisor, as a teacher, as a feminist, and as an activist.
Thank you, Lucy. So an encouraging advice to your past self. Natalie, will you go next?
Of course, and I'm sorry for any background noise with virtual learning happening. What I would say is, the first thing is that this work can be very personal. I do it because I have conviction for this work. You know, it's beyond a passion. It's, you know, what can we do to really move the narrative forward? and it's very contextual. When I begin to think about where I am now and how I've started, I think what just grounds me is that I stay true to those convictions. I stay true to what it is that brought me to this work. And I also try my best not to lose the trust of the people who entrusted me. So if I'm speaking with, you know, Black girls or the parents and the family, they're entrusting me with information. They're entrusting me with knowledge, and what I do with it as a scholar is very important. And so even though I may choose to publish something in an academic journal, I'll make sure that they see it first before it ever gets published. Even though you may not be able to trace it back to them, that's fine. But I want to make sure that they are aware of how their knowledge is moving our field forward. I'll also do talks where I'll say, okay, if this is a research paper, I'm going to break it down, and this is what it actually looks like in practice. This is what it actually looks like and means for our community. And having those conversations allows the work to not just be intellectual, because I think we do a really good job of theorizing and you know, it's talking around, you know, these terms, but I think it just gets down to who, you know, the work that you're actually doing, and our role, and not just as scholars, but also as like cultural brokers, particularly with our the populations in which we're working with. And so I think the advice that I would give to, I don't know, my younger self is just not to lose your sense of self in this work. A lot of times in the academy, it takes me a long time to get things published when I want to, because you know, I'll have reviewers who will tell me to go about it a different way. And most times I'm okay with, you know, most things are okay, and I'll make the changes. But for some of it, it's literally changing the essence of what the work is about. And I think it becomes with a lack of understanding in terms of the foundational knowledge and historical knowledge that comes with actually engaging in this work. So we're always negotiating, and there's some things that I won't negotiate, and I'll rather change the journal that'll be published in, or, you know, there's some things that I just will not stray from. And I think if we don't lose our sense of self and our sense of grounding, and ensure that what we're putting out is actually authentic for our participants, but also is grounded in the history of intersectionality prior to the coining of the term, like Felicia was mentioning. You know, this work was going on way before Kimberly Crenshaw. And if we can begin to look in legal studies where it originated, how are we transferring it over to education, and what that transfer over into science education really means, I think it'll give our work a much deeper grounding, particularly as we're engaging more work around Black and Brown populations, teachers, students, parents, what have you.
Thank you very much. Very good advice. Katie?
So I'm going to just repeat a lot of what has already been said. I would definitely tell my younger self to read more, reflect more, as possible, to really do that introspection. But then I also noticed Felicia had put a comment to have other researchers to discuss your work. And I wish I had done that earlier. I wish I had found other white women doing similar work to discuss with, as well as Black women or just other students in general to discuss with, that I trusted to get that feedback and to throw ideas out there. I think that for me, I was a little bit hesitant. I think it's been mentioned before, and like Lucy said, it took years before she felt comfortable using these theories. And as a white woman, I was hesitant to say, okay, is this my position? Am I misinterpreting things? Things like that. And like Dr. King mentioned also, you get a lot of pushback from trying to publish, or from other researchers, or, you know, we're surrounded by people who have a different perspective or who are using a different lens. So I think I would tell my younger self also to just be a little more courageous in that, and push myself a little bit more, and remember that motivation, like Dr. King said. So I got into this work because I thought it was a social justice issue, and I think it is. I think science identity is a social justice issue, and reminding myself of that, and that you know, it is a privilege to be able to tell these stories, and to be able to work with the participants, and to be a piece of that is a privilege, and I need to take it seriously. And I would remind myself of that.
Thank you so much for very good advices, I think, for not only your past selves, but also all of the rest of us. And perhaps also we will now begin taking steps into the early career.